Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our IG Live today. I have another special guest that's coming on today. It's come with a different kind of take, so I'm thankful that you have joined us. Look at you wonderful people showing up already. That's exciting. That's exciting. So, always happy to see all of you. So, thank you for being here. I have not a flower dot in power on today, and so we get to talk to her. Her name is Halie, and she has an interesting take on what she perceives as sexuality in the church. So I'm looking forward to seeing her as long as she logs on here and says, "Hey, let me join." So, Halie, I need you to push that join button. So you want to join the live. So that will be cool. That'll be fun. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day today. Staying awake. Hopefully, it's warmed up for you. I know that it is. It's supposed to warm slowly up again. So it's Maryland, right? So it's like this all the time. It never seems to level out. Hey, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am good. I am very good. It's good to see you. What have you been up to today?
Just sleeping in. It's my day off, so taking full advantage.
Well, thank you for joining us on your day. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I'm so excited.
Well, awesome. I went ahead and introduced you a little bit, but why don't we take a moment and why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself to everybody that's going to watch this now and will watch this later.
Yeah. So, as you said, my name is Halie. I run notaflower.empower. And so, where that comes from is growing up in purity culture, growing up in the church, we've all heard your sexual purity is like a flower. If it gets crumpled, if it gets crinkled, there's no grace in that. There's no saving that. There's no coming back from that. And that's the only message we received about sex. So, I'm here to say that's not true. So your sexuality is not a flower, and we're here to empower you with the power of education, of learning about your body, of learning about sex, and how all that is okay to talk about in the church. So that's kind of what I'm about, what I talk about on my page. So, and what we'll talk about today.
Awesome. You know, the flower analogy is a lot more, I guess you say, pleasant to think about than the gum analogy, the chewed
Yeah.
up gum. There's just something wrong with all of those things, right? So,
Yeah.
due to the fact that I want the audience to know that you are spearheading talking about, sex within religion, within the church. Um, what is your religious background? Like, give us a little bit of your story.
Yeah. So actually, I wouldn't claim that I grew up in church. I started going to church consistently when I was probably in middle school. My story actually starts with my mom, who was pregnant with me at 15, and she was going to church and at the time, and then basically, I don't know all the details. We haven't like fully dove into that, but she was either shamed out of coming to church or explicitly asked to leave because she was pregnant at 15. So I grew up with this weird perspective from an early age that we believe there's a God. We don't really talk about God. We don't really go to church or, you know, um, do the things that a normal Christian family would do. So I grew up hopping around to different churches, different denominations with friends. My dad's family side is all Catholic. My mom was in a Baptist church. I went to Wesleyan churches, Assemblies of God churches. I feel like that has given me a wide scope of perspective, and we might get into this later, but what kind of led me to having the perspective of God that I do today. So, like I said, I started going to church more consistently. I would say I chose that faith for myself when I was at middle school, right at the height of purity culture. So,
And so just to back up a second, you went through purity. And was the flower analogy mainly what you heard? uh, or was it something different?
I definitely heard that one. The one I can vividly remember is we had purity night. The guys are in one room, the girls are in another room, and our youth pastor's wife was sharing her own story, and she had a big paper heart, and same analogy basically, and it was she every time in her story that she felt that she crossed the line with a guy. She would crinkle the heart or rip a piece off of the heart, and um, basically the same analogy of God can put the pieces back together, but it's never the same. And so, still, as I look back on her story, and I'm like, the shame that she portrayed in that, and in the hopes of preventing us from walking the same road, um, is it makes me feel bad for her. I feel like I can see where she didn't want us to go through that same heartbreak, but it's not was not the story that was gonna help us to redeem that story of her own life. So the message I received around sex growing up was even before I became a Christian. Like I said, my mom had me at 15. So sex is dangerous, sex is bad, sex is to be avoided and not to be talked about. So very evident in that story from my youth pastor's wife. We're not actually talking about sex, we're just talking about why you should avoid it or why it's scary or dangerous or leads to heartbreak. So,
It's additional. It's a fear tactic.
mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So you're still working in a church. What is your position?
Yeah, so I work in a non-denominational church now. I am in a dual role, so I'm partially doing admin things with HR, and then I also oversee digital content.
Hmm.
So social media, our online service, things like that.
Awesome. Okay. And so I've been to your page, and your page is amazing. I love your content, and I love what you're doing. So having someone in the church and bringing this to light obviously is very important, especially with the day and the trauma that has taken place and people that have struggled with purity culture. So what brought about this passion for you to speak up? Like, what is it that made this something that you felt like, hey, this needs to change within church? What caused you to speak up? Because I imagine it's not an easy thing to speak up on because there are a lot of people that don't, want to hear it or want change, or it's a slippery slope or whatever have you. So what is it that gave you the courage and the passion to speak up?
Yeah, I would say my own story. Not a flower, really, I think was the last piece of healing for me. So if we rewind, like I said, I had this belief system around sex that it was bad. We don't talk about it, um, even before I became a Christian. And then becoming a Christian and in purity culture, that only solidified all of it. So fast forward, I get married at 19. I'm in Bible college. I'm the first of my friends to get married. My husband is in ministry, he's a worship leader. So at 19, I'm married into being a pastor's wife at a small church in the South, um, which was a lot to take on.
Yeah.
Um, and I never felt so alone. Just, I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea what I was walking into. And even in premarital counseling, I had expressed like I have a true fear. Like I know I'm about to get married and I know what that means. Like I'm gonna have to have sex for the first time and I know nothing. So even in premarital counseling with our pastor, I'm saying like this is not just like, oh, I don't really know what's going on. It's like a fear. Like I am afraid. um which um like looking back, I wish I would have, and I tell people this, I wish we would have went to a professional counselor. Um, they would have known what to do with that a little more than just a pastor who's walking us through the biblical concepts before marriage. But
Right.
um, anyway, so even from there, it was kind of like, here's a book you can read kind of on your own time. Hope that works out for you. Um, and so even then, I guess, like looking back, I can see the shame of like, oh, that's kind of like I don't know if we're gonna talk about that. Like we kind of talked about it. Like, oh, that's understandable. It's a new thing, a new piece of a relationship, something you've never done before. Read this book. Hope it helps you. Um, and I did, and I felt a little more prepared, but still that fear was there. And so obviously we know we all feel like coming out of purity culture, we're expected now when we get married to just flip the switch. Like you hear that analogy a lot. So that was the hope. And obviously that didn't happen. And so I went on a very long journey, 3 years of anxiety, like full on panic attacks around intimacy and the lack of community that I had only made it worse.
Right.
And again, the shame of we don't talk about sex. So that didn't really allow me to open up to anybody about it. My husband is one of the only few people on staff at this church in the South. Who do I talk to about, oh, I'm having like pain with intercourse and I'm having full on panic attacks with sex. What do I do with that? So that went on for 3 years. Obviously, I got worse and worse because I wasn't addressing it. And finally, I opened up with a friend who she was actually sharing with me about why she had been going to counseling. She was experiencing similar things from her own sexual trauma before marriage and unpacking purity culture and all of that and of how that affected her. And I'm in the back of my head like, oh, I'm not alone. Like
Yeah.
there's nothing like, because you get this thing, like this mindset where you're like, I'm just broken. This is just how it is. And that's a lie. And so I say now on my page a lot, alone is a lie. The more we talk about things that nobody wants to talk about, the more we realize we're not alone in it. So that's kind of what led me to Not a Flower. Is after I spent some time healing myself, I'm like, people need to know this message. People need to know that they're not alone, they're not broken, that we can talk about these things in the church, and that hopefully we set people up for a better experience than what I had. So that's kind of what led me to Not a Flower.
That's awesome. Okay. Yeah. I'll do that all at the same time, right? Because I imagine you're right. I mean, going through premarital counseling in a church is you get a book to read and they cover certain topics, but they never really cover anything about sex, at least educational, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they may say a few things here and there, but it's not educational like what you're doing. So that being said, obviously, I would think, coming from the church myself, that if you brought up the concept of, hey, we need to do more sex education in the church or have it being provided, you would get some sort of pushback. Did you get pushback?
Yeah, so really my voice, I guess, if you want to say, has really been targeted towards individuals and being very open with my own story about women in my own life. There have been instances where I have heard from my pastor's prep that he might be saying one thing or another about sex, and I have gone to him in certain instances and said, like, hey, can I share my story with you? This is why I think maybe we should switch this language a little bit. And it's subtle things. It's nothing, at least from him, that's like talking about purity culture or like blatantly disregarding survivors or things like that. But just some like, hey, this is my story. This is how I kind of hear what you're saying. Maybe consider adding in a second thought of like, if you're struggling, this is not your fault. Or if, and sometimes he's open to it sometimes he's like, no, this is the way I'm going. I'm like, okay, well, I at least feel I did my part to share my perspective and my story.
Right.
So it's not easy to go to our lead pastor and say, hey, this is my story. And it's very, like, I don't mind to do that one-on-one with another woman in my life, but that was a very challenging time to be like, hey, here's my story. And he took it with grace and love, and he listened to my story and said, I'm so sorry that happened to you. But I don't know that I want, to change this topic. So
I think incredibly courageous of you to go to your pastor, sit down, and share that. I think that's amazing that you did that. Very courageous. So, a lot of people that have come through purity culture, um, obviously, you probably know the struggle with the Bible or the God of the Bible today.
mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean that's unfortunately obviously the offshoot of that. So, how do you see the God of the Bible meshing with your teachings on sex education?
mm. Man, part of my healing was coming to terms with um, the Bible and God and faith are not as black and white as we're taught. Um, and at least that's my perspective on it. And so it's hard to sit down, and we don't necessarily, it takes work to sit down and wrestle with the things in the Bible when we could just give a quick answer of, here's the answer, here's how we justify that these things don't line up, or here's how we justify this, like here's the right answer that we're taught, and we just move on and we're expected to just accept it. It takes more work to sit down and wrestle with that yourself. But I think that's where, for me, like true healing and true faith and true like relationship with God came. Like I wasn't just taking in these spoon-fed answers of the Bible is this and this is right and this is wrong. For example, a large part of my healing, I started going through physical therapy for my pelvic floor. And my physical therapist suggested that when I use dilators, which I was like, okay, I can do that. I can do that. But she recommended I get a vibrator. And that kind of just like took me back. Like, is that okay? Is that weird? That seems very like shameful to me. Like, is that okay in marriage? So I had to wrestle with that and come to terms with, if I'm using a vibrator, basically that's masturbation. And is that okay? And based on what I've been taught, I would lean towards, I was taught, no, that's not okay. But wrestling with, I feel like that is a gray area that God left gray. It's not explicitly talked about in the Bible as right or wrong or as sin, but we have made it that. Like we have drawn a line in the sand. So I like to say we like to, make things black and white that God intentionally left gray.
Right.
And what if God left something gray for someone like me? Like what if God left masturbation gray so that I could become comfortable in my own body to fulfill this beautiful picture that sex is to be in marriage, but there was no way for me to get there to be comfortable with somebody else with my body if I wasn't comfortable with myself, Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my example of wrestling with that gray. And so the God of the Bible, I think, is way less black and white than we make him, especially around things like sex, because it's so complicated and there's so much hurt in the world. And so the Christians, we talk about, like kind of alluded to this picture of this beautiful marriage of what sex should be. And if you wait, then that's what's going to happen. And I love to just, this is my own guess, my own, reading into it, but I just love the picture of like God had enough foresight to see me in 2022, or at the time, like 2019, Halie needing a road out and needing a way to that picture of this perfect, thing that sex can be in marriage. But that's not what happened for me. And so I struggle, and this is this is a little side note. I like struggle so much with, we condemn divorce, and there's so much shame in that as well, but we don't give people the tools for a healthy sex life that leads to that picture of marriage. We just say, this is the goal and this is what's going to happen if you wait, but we're not giving the people the tools to set them up for a successful marriage. And so, like, if we don't want divorce in the church, then we're going to have to talk about sex, and we're going to have to prepare people better for marriage, So that's my own little side note about.
I think there's some validity to that. A lot of the stress and pressure within marriage is a lot of, like, when you go through purity culture, your sex life. There's money like that, but it doesn't ever turn out the way you thought it would turn out, right? So, and that leads me to my next question with you, is obviously thinking about the next generation of kids within church, okay? How would you implement sex education or guidance to help young people today within the church?
Yeah, that's a hard question that I wrestle with often. It seems so daunting and so like it's gonna be a long journey, but I'm in it for the long haul. But my thought on it, at least now as I've wrestled with it, is well, first, the church thinks parents are talking about sex so that they don't need to. Parents think the school is talking about sex so they don't need to talk about it. And the school maybe hits on that in health class, but my perspective, and again, just me for my page, my hope is that the church will change and do better in this area, is that if God created sex to be this beautiful thing, and again, if we are trying to prevent divorce and create healthy marriages, then the church should own that area. We shouldn't be just putting that off to parents, and parents who are believers should not be putting that off to schools. Like, we should stand up and say, like, no, this is a gift from God. We believe that. Then we're going to own it, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to set it up well and to be successful for you. Getting there, I think, like I said, going to be a long journey.
Right.
And I think it starts with people, like me, doing my own like self-healing and helping others along the way. But we have to be able to make church a safe space for that conversation. And that, to me, like, looking back on purity nights, that was not a safe space. Like, they tried to be like, hey, does anyone have any questions? There's no wrong questions. There's nothing, you can't ask. But one night a year does not reverse, the rest of the year's worth of shame about sex. The shame of, oh, so-and-so is holding hands in 2 rows up during service, or they're sitting too close together, or, we have to do better about those things, about those conversations. Like, it's not a bad thing to hold hands. You're 16 and, in love. That's fine. So I think it starts there. It starts with our conversations around sex and creating that safe space individually before we can just get on stage and start talking about sex education, either with adults or with students and kids. And hopefully parents who have done that healing work or been in groups or whatever that looks like to do that healing work can pass that on to their kids. And that's the other thing. I think sex education starts from an early age. And it doesn't have to be purely about sex, because I think purity culture and sexual shame also comes with body shame. So just learning about your body, anatomy is not shameful. Talking about that with your 5-year-old is okay. And I think it starts there. And we have to tear down those barriers of shame. And I think it starts young. And then hopefully we create that safe space um, as people grow up into their teen years and they're wrestling with where's the line, and they're wrestling with, you know, do I love this boy and what do I do and what's okay and what's not okay, and how we handle those conversations is really, I think, where it starts. So
Um, I'm not trying to bamboozle you with a question because something came to my mind. So you have
go
free
ahead.
to answer it if you don't want to answer it. I'm talking about, and I love how proactive you are, and it's creating a safe space where there's no shame. Okay. Um, is that possible? Obviously, I would think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that's not possible for everybody because the church's stance on homosexuality or things like that. So when you're talking about this from a purely heterosexual
Mm-hmm.
kind of aspect. Is that correct?
Yeah, I totally get that, and I think that's a very interesting like point and perspective. I think that's probably absolutely true. Of there's a lot less of a safe space.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I just
which
clarified
hopefully, also something that the church can work on and needs to do better at. Um, so yeah, absolutely.
that, if everybody is truly welcome
Mm-hmm.
without the bait and switch, that it could be a safe space. But all that to say, thank you for answering that question. That just kind of came to mind. I want to clarify for audiences that are listening to this. What is, in your opinion, is the number one misunderstood thing about sex within the church?
And this is, I mean, probably a simple answer, but that sex is bad. I mean, that's the overarching message um, that is communicated either verbally or non-verbally through that shame aspect. There's an account called the Big Kids Table. They're in Australia doing similar work to what I am. Um, they go into schools and churches and talk about sex education. But they say God is good and so is sex. And I love that. Um, so I think the biggest misconception is that we can't talk about it or that it's bad or shameful to talk about. So I know it's a really simple answer, but
Oh, that's honestly probably the most accurate answer if I'm thinking about my years, right? Um, so just to kind of bring us, because sex is bad idea. Um, you'd mentioned vibrator and stuff like that. Is masturbation seen as bad, or is that part of the education of sex within the church?
within the church or as far as
You, we'll go you, because I know you probably can't answer for all the churches, right? So,
yeah. Well, I will say, like I kind of mentioned earlier, as far as from a church perspective, I've heard of it. Even if, again, sometimes it's not explicitly communicated that this is sin or this is bad, but it's wrapped into that shame.
right.
So if I am masturbating, then I'm looping it in with sex and with this shame or with this narrative that has already been written for me from the church, even if the church didn't explicitly say this is bad or this is sin. Um, for me, like I said, was a vital part of my healing, and I had to figure out again where is that line, because I think there is a place where it can be harmful, and I had to come to this place for me. This is where I kind of landed. Is it helping my marriage? And this is in the context of I'm married and I was wrestling with this. Is it helping my marriage or is it hurting my marriage? Because in some instances, it can be hurting if I choose, if my partner is more than willing and healthy and able and wanting to have
Mhm.
intercourse and
Right.
I choose to masturbate instead, then and I'm withholding for my own pleasure or laziness or just lack of communication sometimes, like it's hard work to initiate sometimes and or to deal with that rejection, and sometimes it's just easier to be like, well, I'll just take care of it myself and we'll do it on our scheduled night, you know. It takes a lot more communication and a lot more work, but or even introducing pornography into that, like obviously I think that is a place of hurting your marriage. um so I do, to also draw that line, I do think there is a possibility to separate masturbation and lust. um to me, masturbation just becoming familiar with your body, becoming familiar what touch feels good and what, you know, is pleasurable, what's not pleasurable. Um, and then, like I said, though, that I do think that there is a line that it can be harmful, but to me, it was a step of healing. So it was helping my marriage, which is kind of has how I kind of, you know, I don't want to say justified, like that sounds like a bad word, but how I came to terms with it, I guess, is a better way to
So,
say.
interesting point. Okay, so when you're talking about sex education with students,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty often that they don't wait and they masturbate through their teen lives. So how do you deal with that shame
Mm,
with what they're experiencing? Like, how do you educate them on it, right?
yeah. Um, well, there are studies too that masturbation, I mean, any sort of pleasure releases chemicals in the brain
Right.
that are can be addicting. And so, again, walking that fine line of it can be harmful if it gets out of hand. And I think there is a lesson in waiting. So people will ask me a lot, well, are you still for abstinence? Are you still for waiting? Um, and I think I am. I say I think, because there is a lesson in self control in that, and the discipline of we think I'm just going to get married. I'm going to get to have sex whenever I want. That's not true. You're dealing with a completely human being. And in my husband's case, I wasn't able to fully like relax and pleasurably have sex for years. And so what does that mean for him? Um, and so there is a balance and I think a lesson in that of we can teach that is not shameful, that you should explore your body. You should be fine with figuring out what feels good or doesn't feel good or how your vulva looks. Like nobody, like there's shame in even in that, like figuring out what's normal for your body. What does your body look like and being comfortable with that. But also knowing that waiting is there is benefit to it. So
Okay, that's interesting. I'm sure that you probably get a lot of questions about that
yeah.
within your teachings. Okay, so fascinating information. Love it. I want to thank you for answering my questions that weren't even on our list.
Yeah,
They just came up as you were talking. So
no problem.
Ed didn't ask anything that you didn't want to answer. But so you're continuing this, for lack of better words, this fight to,
Mm-hmm.
you know, education in the church. How can people follow, support you, and encourage you and see this happening?
Yeah. Um, I have been in a, and this is not a very like exciting answer probably, but I have been in a place the last couple months, and I've kind of been open with my followers throughout the journey of, um, I just have had to take a step back a little bit from Not a Flower. Like I was creating a lot of reels and a lot of just, I want to I want to be like the lighthearted best friend that sits with you on the couch and is like, yeah, let's talk about your sex life. Like it's fine. Laugh about it and like, um and also get into the hard issues. But I think if we can't laugh about it, then we'll cry about it. And there's some of that too. but but I want to get back to that. That is the goal. But I had to take some time away. It is, you know, you called it a fight. It's a hard fight, at least for me, even just mentally and emotionally, and sometimes
A vulnerable fight, right? I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
So,
I
and with taking over digital content with my job, it's kind of exhausting to come home and then just want to also be on social media as my like side hobby. So finding that balance has been interesting for me as well, if I'm just being honest. So the goal really is follow me on Instagram. I do want to get back to your lighthearted best friend on the couch making reels. That is the goal. But
Well, I really appreciate you coming on your day off,
yeah.
and talking about a very important topic, and one that's obviously challenging within the church. And so it's encouraging to hear that you are doing what you're doing. It's very brave of you, very courageous, and I can't wait to see how it all unfolds for you. And hopefully, this will have more movements within the church world.
Yeah.
Um, Talk about more sex education and prepare people for it. And as you said, you think it's a strong correlation to having a better marriage too, right?
Mhm.
So purity culture. So I think that I think you're doing great work. For anybody that is not following her, hop on over and follow her. She is definitely worth the follow. She's got great content, and as you just heard, I mean, her heart's one to hey, let's sit on the couch and talk about it. We may not agree on everything, but we can still be friends and talk about it. It doesn't have to
Mhm.
be fighting kind of thing. So, thank you very much, Halie,
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
and for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, and this fills me up. So this is great. I love to do this on my day off. Um, like I said, social can just be draining, and what fills me is really hearing other people's stories that say, "Me too," or "I'm wrestling with this." Um, I love these. Like we don't have to agree, and I think when you and I talked, this came up a lot of everyone's just doing the best that they can to figure out life, to figure out faith. Um, and I think even like I have come to a place in my healing, and I think a lot of people can't get there, and that's totally fine and understandable. But I have come to a place where I can look back on my youth pastor's wife, or I can look back on people that did speak that negative message to me with grace, and to just say they were doing the best with the information that they had at the time. Um, and that doesn't, to like, I have come to a place where I can come to terms with that doesn't take away the hurt that I went through.
Right.
But I can separate that and look at it and know they were doing the best that they could. It still resulted in hurt, and we still need to do better. Um, but I think that's true of all of us in life. Like we're just doing our best to figure it out. And so the more we can wrestle together and the more we can talk about the things that are uncomfortable or that people don't want to talk about, I think the better we'll all be for it. So yeah.
Awesome. Wise word. Appreciate that. So thank you very much. That's awesome. What great note to end on. Um,
Yeah.
have a wonderful rest of your day. To all of our people that have watched or will watch, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you later. All right. Thank you, Halie.
Yeah. See ya.
Yep. Bye bye.